Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Jumping into the next story, or before that, if you missed the first segment, I talked about the Chargers' new defensive coordinator and his thoughts on the defense and what player specifically he wanted to help reach his full potential. Now, jumping into the next segment of the show, the Buffalo Bills, in general, Stefon Diggs. Now, the Bills are one of those teams, playoff contending teams. They'll continue to be that as long as Josh Allen is there. He has cemented himself as a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. You know, there's some debate on others. He's in the top 7. I'll give 7 if there's some other debate out there. But regardless, he is a generational type of talent. Physically, he's a fridge, basically, the way he's built, the way he can run the ball at his size. He's a more athletic Big Ben, and because of that, he has brought the Buffalo Bills to the point of, always being around the AFC divisional round, always making the playoffs. They always have a chance with Josh Allen. And what does Josh Allen need to succeed? A wide receiver 1, which has been Stefon Diggs up to this point, the majority of his career. They've had a lot of success together. They are really the catalyst, or have been the catalyst for this offense. But now the Bills find themselves in a difficult spot with their salary cap, where they're going to have to make some tough decisions. And some of those decisions actually came today. Just before I jumped on to the air to do the show today, I saw that they made a lot of cuts, mostly with their defense and their offense as well. They cut their longtime corner, Tre'Davious White. They released their longtime safety, Jordan Poyer. Micah Hyde was also already going to be a free agent, so both starting safeties have been cut. They also released their starting center, Mitch Morse, wide receiver, Deontay Hardy, and running back, Nyheim Hines. All of that to try and realign their cap space and get under the cap before the new league year starts. And that was obviously a tough blow, but they had to make some decisions because they had to get under that salary cap. And it brings me to now this point where all the trade rumors start to swirl. Some people might value their defense more than their offense, specifically how they were trending towards last season. I thought, just from watching a lot of their games leading up to the playoffs, that they were becoming a more run-heavy team. They were relying a lot more on the tight end position, and a lot of dump-offs, a lot of read options. Josh really not taking the big, risky throws downfield to Diggs a lot of times, but rather checking it down, finding the easier options through James Cook, Dalton Kincaid, Dawson Knox, and Stefon Diggs, don't get me wrong, was still involved. But a stat that I just found interesting was that with Stefon Diggs and his production over last season, it sort of dropped in a bit, where in some areas he almost had the same amount of targets, but the depth of those targets reduced a fair amount. It went from 11.2, the depth that he ran his route at, and it dropped to about 10.3 as the season went on. His yards per game also went down from 89 per game to 70 yards per game, and that led into some pretty bad performances offensively from the Bills. Josh trying to force it into Stefon Diggs, and Stefon Diggs, you could say, wasn't getting open as easily as he once was. He is getting closer to 30 now, if he's not already there. So that sort of development, physical development in his game, has kind of affected how he is as a wide receiver, how much he can contribute compared to Kincaid, James Cook, who are all young and are more physically able to do the sort of things that the Bills kind of were trending to in the run game. And Stefon Diggs will always have the support of Josh Allen. But when you see the drop in performances, drop in stats like that, these rumors will start to build up a lot more. And, on top of that, Gabe Davis, who was another wide receiver for them, he is looking more and more likely to leave the Buffalo Bills as well because of that salary cap. He's only still 25 years old, so he could get a decent deal somewhere else. and it just really didn't make sense for him to stay there. We'd rather look out for, his personal benefit, look for the money elsewhere, and still be on a competitive team as well. He didn't perform as well as he did last year, but that was in part due to injury and stuff like that. So we'll see what kind of contract Gabe Davis gets. But back on Stefon Diggs, it now puts you in this weird spot with Diggs where you're going to lose Gabe Davis. I already mentioned the other offensive players they lost. They're still not under the cap, I believe, at this moment, but they could certainly be if they trade Stefon Diggs. But you're now in this place where, do you trade him, and then what wide receivers are you left with? But when I wrote the notes down for this, when I was going to make this one of the topics on today's show, they hadn't done any of those cuts, so a Stefon Diggs trade looked a lot more realistic at that point because, defensively, did you want to risk that? Do you want to potentially give Stefon Diggs up based on the trend that he's been on in a lot of reduction of yards per game, depth of targets, and stuff like that? Did it seem reasonable to give him up? Bills general manager, Brandon Beane, didn't think so. At the combine, he said, yeah, I expect him, that being Diggs, to be here. In a simple response to all these trade rumors, Brandon Beane said he expects Diggs to be here. And after these cuts, it only backs that up even more and more. But, like I mentioned, they're still not under the cap. And if they were to trade Stefon Diggs for those cap allegations or that cap alleviation, with a standard trade of Diggs, the Bills could carry nearly a $30 million cap charge, over $3 million more than it would cost to keep him if they were just to trade him regularly. So that from that point, it doesn't really make sense to trade him, which is probably the biggest reason why the Bills didn't trade him. Because if it was just a normal trade like that, they would carry more money than it would cost to keep him. The other scenario that could have popped up was if they released him after June 1st, like they did with Tre'Davious White. They'd get stuck with a $22 million cap charge, but that would be in 2025, and they would save about $19 million this year if they needed the money desperately this year, which was probably going to be the more likely scenario, but they decided to take that route with Tre'Davious White. Now he's gone, and he's able to sign somewhere else. He's coming off of 2 knee injuries. It's going to be tough for anybody to give him a big contract, but I still believe he can contribute something to a defense elsewhere, and it'll be interesting to see where he goes. But with that, on top of the other releases, Stefon Diggs staying with the Bills seems more and more likely than it did before. And at this point, with everything that I just said, it looks like Stefon Diggs is going to get another chance in Buffalo. Not that he doesn't deserve it, but you'll have a lot of people saying in a lot of games, if the Bills don't perform well, or if they're not having the kind of numbers that they have had in the past, why they're going to start raising questions about why Stefon Diggs is still there, quite frankly, and why he's not performing up to the amount of money that he's getting paid. And that all depends on their results. Those results could depend greatly on the releases that they had. If they don't compensate for replacing those guys, very meaningful and impactful guys, not just in terms of on the field, but off the field as well. Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer, the essential leaders of this team on the defensive side and overall. Now you're going to have to find new voices, new leadership. Potentially it could fall on Josh Allen more. I don't know how much he stepped into that leadership role, but Stefon Diggs is also another one that could take up that voice in the locker room and be that leader. But you have to wait and see how it all gels. That's the biggest part of the NFL season, how all the pieces to the puzzle fit together, what kind of moves you make to build this roster that you see potentially competing into January and February. And just on that note, he's still, Stefon Diggs, going back to Stefon Diggs, he still garners wide receiver 1 targets, but he's getting them on shorter routes now and with less and doing less with them as well, according to a lot of statistics and reports that I saw on ESPN and from a lot of different sources. So how do you fix that? I've listed out all these issues potentially with Stefon Diggs. How do you fix it? If I'm thinking about it, it all has to play into the kind of identity that they're trying to build into now. With them being a bit more run heavy, a lot of teams are going to start to pile the box, get a lot more people in there to stop James Cook, to stop Josh Allen, especially from those QB sneaks or those read options. You're going to have a lot more people condensed in there, and that way it could open up the field a little bit more for Stefon Diggs. Yeah, it might take away from his targets, and we might see a little bit more decrease, but I think the efficiency of that production from Stefon Diggs will grow greatly rather than throwing him 10 targets, having him catch about 4 of them, have 60 or 70 yards and no touchdowns. I think those numbers say a lot more and a lot more eye-catching than maybe 5 catches on 5 targets, 70 to 80 yards on play-action throws, longer ones with one-on-one coverage and a touchdown. It might not look a little different, but I think a lot of people would take that over the other side of it if it means winning games, controlling the ball, the possession of the ball, and being more efficient with what you do with Stefon Diggs rather than just force-feeding him ball after ball after ball and hoping he does something with it. If they're just going to double-team him, that's another thing. They were still more likely double-teaming Stefon Diggs, and he wasn't able to get open in that. And with Josh Allen force-feeding him the ball, it led to interceptions, bad throws, and a lot of miscommunication, frustration spilling onto the sideline. All of that, I think, if I were to fix it, I would decrease the quantity of the targets and try to increase the quality of it to benefit not only Diggs, but this entire team. And again, now you're in a spot where you already made the decisions to move on from your defensive stalwarts, Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde, Tre'Davious White, resetting on defense. Now we're just at a wait-and-see point. Realistically, was it worth it to keep Stefon Diggs and the offensive side of the ball basically all together and give up some of that defensive side of the ball? Because I think recently the Bills have been very well organized on defense. They've been known for their defense a lot recently, and it's going to look very different now, and I'm very interested to see how they play off of that, how the offense potentially gets better and now becomes the identity a lot more than the defensive side of the ball. It'll put more pressure on Josh Allen for sure and Diggs to perform, but that's just going to come with the repetition and getting everybody acclimated to each other and this new style, which I think benefits them more because you have to take advantage of Josh Allen's physicality, his build, quite frankly. His arm talent is there. It's exceptional, but you could definitely overdo the arm talent and force it into bad situations more often than not than if you ran the ball. Were a lot more physical with run plays because those just carry less risk than throwing the ball 30 to 40 times per game, obviously. They'll have more possession of the ball, and I think it'll make Josh Allen a lot more efficient going forward. He's able to keep Stefon Diggs around. I'm sure that makes him happy. I'm sure Stefon Diggs is a lot more at ease. But you never know, again, in the NFL. They could make a surprise trade if the package is there. But for now, it looks like the band is staying together. The dynamic duo of Diggs and Josh Allen looks to be staying together. And I will put a pin on that conversation. And I will transition now into another break in the show. And on the other side of the break, on the other half of this show, I will bring up what happened on franchise tag deadline day, what moves were made, what players were tagged, what players weren't tagged, and my thoughts on all of that, making sure you guys didn't miss any of the news that dropped yesterday. I'll have it all on here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back.